Wireless security. How is it different from regular security, and what's new? Exciting new developments for security and exciting new developments for breaking security. In particular, we'll be talking about new approaches to post-quantum security, well suited to the heterogeneity of wireless networks. On the other hand, I'll be looking at systems like physical layer security, and I'll show that our new algorithm, guessing random additive noise decoding, can actually be a very good tool to break that kind of security. Good news, bad news, well, maybe good news if you're trying to break things. So come and we'll fix things and break other things.
Welcome to talk.cybercni.fr.
Bienvenue.
Welcome to the 32nd edition of Talk CyberCNI. And today is the Christmas edition, and I have a very great Christmas present for you because we have a wonderful talk by Muriel Medard, who will be talking about revisiting wireless security. And so this is definitely another highlight for this year. And before we come to Muriel, before I will present her, as always, you know it, we are live and we have a feedback tooling in place for you in order to give feedback, to ask your questions, and we're looking forward to many of your questions because this is really a topic that is important and interesting to many of you. Let me switch to the Slido. So 1 second, I'll just switch the camera here so that you also see me. Okay, so yeah, now you see me again. So yeah, so on the left you see the link, so it's sli.do/talk33, so this is where you can ask your questions, where you can put your comments, and as always it's a good idea to join the second screen, because even if you don't have a question for the moment, it's interesting to look at what are the questions that are floating by. You can upvote and download questions, so you know it is the 33rd edition. So the topic for today is revisiting wireless security, and let's just fix that here, sorry for that. And the speaker today is Muriel Medard. Muriel is the NEC Professor of Software Science and Engineering in the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science Department at MIT. There she leads the Network Coding and Reliable Communications Group in the Research Laboratory for Electronics at MIT, and she is Chief Scientist for Steinwurf, which she has co-founded. She obtained 3 bachelor degrees as well as her Master of Science and SCD all from MIT. Muriel has supervised over 40 master students, over 20 doctoral students, and over 25 postdoctoral fellows. She currently serves as editor-in-chief of the IEEE Transactions on Information Theory and served previously as editor-in-chief of the IEEE Journal on Selected Areas in Communications. Muriel was elected president of the IEEE Information Theory Society in 2012, and she serves on its board of governors, having previously served for 11 years. She has over 60 US and international patents awarded, the vast majority of which have been licensed or acquired. So this is great, and I'm super happy having Muriel with us today, and I'm looking forward to her talk. And without further ado, Muriel, I hand over to you, and the stage is yours.
And thank you very much for the invitation. There is an echo. I don't know if that's okay. Super. So let me pull up my slides. Can you see my slides?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. I know that there were some issues earlier when I was putting it in a slideshow, so I'm just going to step through them like this. I think it's still visible, and please just stop me at any minute if there's a problem. So the topic, as we said, is revisiting wireless security. Some good news, some bad news. depending on whether you're an attacker or a defender, whether which ones are good and which ones are bad will vary. But I hope all of them will be interesting news. So why is this a good time to revisit wireless security? Well, it's been funny, having worked on this for a long time, to start hearing in the news, in basically the popular press or on the radio, people talking about wireless security. And I think it's really with the advent of 5G that people have gotten more concerned or more interested in this topic. And of course, we can't forget that during during COVID, so many of us were relying on Wi-Fi, and uh, in effect, that was what was carrying a lot of the economy. People started realizing how much of their crucial activities were actually being carried on a wireless link, and starting considering what were the aspects there that might be really relevant to security. And on the other side, on the technical side, there's a confluence of many different factors, which is making the topic increasingly complex. And, as I said, it's sort of really gone from a pretty specialist area to a highly discussed area. And let me just talk about some of the factors and we'll go over them. So I think that the first factor is really heterogeneity. Heterogeneity of manufacturers and technologies, ranging from traditional mobile operators to Wi-Fi, to the fact that, my 5G phone here is usually mostly a Wi-Fi box. And the fact that, there's no way that we're going to have a centralized orchestrated system. On the crypto side, whether you're wireless or not, there's been, of course, the advent of, or at least the let's say the rise of quantum computing. We just saw some really interesting announcements last week in this domain, particularly with better ability to do error correction. And so, when you look at something like RSA and its newfound fragility, let's say, then the concerns around traditional crypto have risen quite a bit. At the same time, some of the non-traditional crypto approaches, the particularly information theoretic community to which I belong, as Mark Oliver said, some of those topics that people had been studying for a long time, really since the 70s, have been shown actually not to be as robust. And that's some of my own work with that of Ken Duffy. And there we see a fragility that was not suspected up until now, but is actually quite concerning. And then we have the introduction of new technologies, particularly at very high frequencies, and those present some new vulnerabilities. So let me start maybe with the first two, which is the topic of heterogeneity, along with the topic of what we often call post-quantum crypto. It's funny because post-quantum crypto is really sort of, um, you know, earlier coding based information theoretic crypto. And so we'll go a little bit into that. And the question is, can we take these two topics and somehow join them and make something stronger? And what I mean by that is that, in sort of the traditional security setting, where you have Alice and you have Bob, and now you have multiple connections, and you have, let's say, our typical eavesdropper named Eve. You can have sort of a couple of different types of Eves. And one type of Eve is an Eve that maybe only has access to some of the links. So, for instance, in this case, she has access to the 5G network, maybe the satellite network, maybe some other network, LoRa or whatever, but she doesn't have access to the Wi-Fi, say. Versus a strong Eve that somehow has access to all these different links, including a 4G link, et cetera, et cetera. So let's say the weak Eve here is going to obtain information transmitted over fewer links, and a strong Eve is going to obtain information transmitted over all the paths. Okay, so when we talk about secure post-quantum solutions, what are we really talking about? We're really talking about coding where you can see the plus with a little circle. You can think of this as coding over, say, a prime field, so some Galois field. um, Generally binary is not enough, but it suffices definitely to think in binary. uh, And what you would have for perfect secrecy would be a one-time pad. So a one-time pad would be, for instance, here on each of these paths, you would protect each of the paths with a key with a rate, that's to say, number of bits per transmission, which would be the same as the rate of the message, right? So in order to protect both of these paths perfectly against a strong Eve who gets to see both of these paths, what would happen is that Alice and Bob would share these two one-time pads, and then Bob would get the messages back. So the messages are called M here, and H here. H is the Shannon entropy. What would happen is here you would have perfect secrecy. That's to say that the Shannon entropy of the message, given X is still the full entropy. That's to say that there really is no leakage whatsoever between what's being transmitted, which we generally denote by X, which is the sum in this case of M and R, again, the sum over a finite field. And the key entropy here, the entropy of the key R, is as large as the message. So, of course, this is perfectly secure. The problem is that you no longer have a system where the key is less onerous to transmit than the message. And so basically all you can do here is like take advantage of non-simultaneity. If you had a channel which was secret where you could send as much information as the information you need to transmit, why not use that one to send the message? The only reason might be that maybe the key can be shared ahead of time, but there's no benefit in rate. Okay. So, another approach, which is basically giving you the same performance as before, except when Eve is weak, is actually just to mix the two messages together. Okay, so basically what we do here is what we call individual secrecy, because you can have secrecy over any individual path. You can actually have secrecy over any collection of paths as long as the number of paths is smaller than the total. The number of paths that weak Eve observes is smaller than the total number of paths. So we have Alice, we have Bob, in this case, I have a very simple code represented there by that matrix G. So you can see what that matrix G is doing. It's sending on path 1, M1 plus M2, and it's sending on path 2, M1 plus 2, M2. Now what happens here again is my rate is now what happens is my rate is 1. I basically don't have a key. Really what I'm doing here is um, my messages be one-time pads to each other. Now you have to be careful. We'll see that later. It has to be the case that the messages have really themselves full entropy. That's to say, we need to have compressed them first and compress them well enough. Again, we'll see that later why it's important. And of course, it has to be that both of the messages are truly unknown to Eve. So if the observation by Eve, which is denoted here by Y sub EW, is the of weak Eve, you can see that she actually cannot know anything about either message 1 or message 2. And again, this is the individual secrecy. She does know something, so it's individual relative to any one of the messages. She does know something, of course, about the ensemble of the messages, but she doesn't know anything about any one of the messages. And again, this holds as long as she doesn't get to see all of the paths. Okay. Now, um, there is a different approach to this, which is often looked through signal to noise ratio instead, which is something where rather than adding the messages quite in the way that's here, is you actually try to have something where you create virtually these two links. And basically, what happens is that the weak Eve is seeing only a virtual single link, and this and basically Bob is seeing like two links. And really, the difference between the two links is that in physical layer security is that one of the links has a higher signal is that you really one of the links has a lower signal to noise ratio, and you mimic having two links as having a higher signal to noise ratio. So the idea there is that Bob is really only actually seeing a single path with a higher SNR, but you could represent that signal path with a higher SNR than weak Eve as being as though he had some extra information because of the higher SNR. And so that extra information that comes from the higher SNR is like having an extra path. Okay. So this is also the idea behind physical layer security we'll talk about later. Okay. Now, when we talk about post-quantum systems, what are we talking about? So it's not a one-time pad. And it's not just individual security, but knowing about the one-time pad and individual security are really useful because it actually is a bit of a meld of those two things that gives us this post-quantum security. And so here's in a nutshell, the McLeese crypto system, named after the late great Bob McLeese, who was a very distinguished colleague in information theory. And particularly for those of you who are following the NIST exercise, the National Institute of Standards in the U.S., uh, which is in process right now of actually developing the post quantum, and we'll see later what we call them post quantum systems. You may recall that McLeese is one of the last still standing. So, of course, there were a huge number of candidates, and it goes round after round after one. So McLeese, which actually dates back to the 70s, is kind of like the granddaddy of these systems. It is still standing, still unbroken, as we'll see later. That's not a small deal. Okay, so McLeese is a public key crypto system. And it's going to have a combination of an error correcting code, where an error correcting code, what it does is it takes k bits and it maps them onto n bits. So it creates a redundancy or repair of n minus k. So it puts in an error correction code, and there's a secret key, a public key, and an error vector. An encryption function encrypts the message M along with the public key and this extra error vector Z. And the decryption function is able to decrypt along when it also has the secret key S. Okay. And really, the idea here is that, in the original McLeese, the rate, that's to say, the amount of useful throughput versus the extra redundancy that you put in is about 3/4. So 0.76 is that k over n. What this means is that you're sacrificing about a quarter of your bandwidth for this security. And the idea with McLeese is the following. You basically have a system where Bob is having to figure out that error vector. It's really, really hard, but it's able to because of the structure of the error correction code, which we're not going to go into. That in McLeese, it's GOPA codes. Um, but for Eve, even for strong Eve who gets to see both paths, she's really not able to do it. Okay. So it's a computational secure system. That's to say that um, it's not like, for instance, the one-time pad, which is information theoretically secure. You just cannot figure out at all anything about the original messages from observations. It's computational secure, but it's still extremely well known. Extremely, it's well known to be extremely strong. Okay. One of the things that we worked on recently with my former postdoc, Alejandro Cohen. Alejandro is now a professor at Technion in the ECE department. Rafael de Oliveira. Rafael is a professor in the math department now at Clemson. He was also in my group as a postdoc. My former student Saman Salamatian, who has gone to Wall Street and all kinds of great things. We came up with this method called network coding based quantum cryptography. And what you're doing here is, this is sort of a meld, if you will, of McLeese and the physical layer security aspects, where you have this mixture of the messages. What we do here is that rather than send the message as before with the Z and P by itself, we actually are going to encrypt one of the paths, but protect the other path through coding. Okay. And now what happens is that, if you recall, we only had individual security here when we were using, in effect, a self-keyed system where the paths were encrypting each other. Here with McLeese, we could have a strong Eve. So what we're doing here is now we're still able to have a strong Eve, but in the case of two paths, we are also able to up the rate. Now, the same caveats hold as before. The messages have to be um, properly compressed. However, the rate can also be higher. That's to say that the loss of data to the encryption is lesser and lesser. So, basically what happens is, if you look at the individual security code that I showed you there on the left versus Hunk versus the McLeese system, the information rate is considerably better than McLeese, and actually can be made as close as we want to one, which is what you would get with just the individual security for just a weak Eve. Okay, while still being able to counteract a strong Eve. Now, why is this important? Sorry, there's a typo there. Reed Mueller, the read should be REED. Basically, as I mentioned, McLeese uses GOPA codes. And now if you look at the different kinds of other families of codes that have been proposed, they have all been broken. Sometimes within the same year, it's not surprising that the PCs are very sparse codes were broken right away. But you would imagine that something like concatenated codes would have been possibly secure, and indeed, it took basically a dozen years to break it. But basically, many of these end up broken. So we can do this hunk scheme, and basically what I wanted to point out for the purposes of looking at it in the wireless system is that actually, if you have this multipath heterogeneous systems, the delays are very, very good. Here what we did is we have 4 communication links, 1 satellite and 3 5G links. And you have probably erasures given by epsilon, which are given in the on two links are given in the x and y axis here in this Cartesian coordinate. And the basic idea is that you can incorporate in a streaming system with existing protocols over multipath. You can incorporate Hunk, this hybrid system with network coding. And we do this using random linear network coding, which was also developed in my lab. And you can see a really, really fantastic gain in throughput versus, say, just using one path or um, using only very simple feedback schemes. Okay, so this is in effect one of the good news. I told you it would be a mix of wired good news and bad news. And some of the good news here is that heterogeneity, which is generally considered to be a security risk, with this notion of the weakest link, that if somebody breaks into, say, your Wi-Fi, your 5G, your LTE, your satellite, whatever, then that link is a vulnerability for the entire system if the system's using heterogeneous links. It's actually quite the contrary. If you code over them and you use systems like Honk, you will not only get security, you will potentially get post-quantum secure systems. So that's some of the good news. Let's go look at some of the bad news. And this is a nice time for us to revisit that topic of physical layer security that I mentioned to you before. So remember what I said physical layer security does is it sort of relies on signal to noise ratio to say it's equivalent, because Bob has a higher signal to noise ratio and therefore can have a better throughput from Alice. It's equivalent to having Bob have two links, whereas Eve, that has a lower signal to noise ratio and therefore has a lesser throughput, it's equivalent to Eve having only one link. So generally relies on these signal to noise ratio assumptions. It requires a couple of very strong assumptions: completely uniform messages, and also a noise model, generally IID, so independent, identically distributed. So it's always giving you at best statistical guarantees of security. Now, it's a topic that has been investigated at great length in information theory, but always in a very asymptotic regime. So let's talk a little bit about a somewhat different notion of security relative to sort of the crypto type security. Let's talk about guesswork, which was a notion brought up by another late great Jim Massey in the mid 90s. Jim Massey looked at the following question, which is, of course, extremely important for security, which is, hey, if somebody's trying to guess a password, how long is it going to take them? Very fundamental question, very relevant to many of our current security systems. And the idea here is Eve doesn't. Eve has some knowledge about the source statistics and is going to keep guessing until she guesses the correct password. So, for instance, this is something where you can do an analysis. For instance, if a system is using password cracking, it's using public leaked password files, then you can represent those statistically, and you can see on average how long it's going to take to password crack, and there's a lot of fun math you can do around that. Okay, just a little, maybe a little bit more math than I would usually put in a talk, but just at a very high level. Why do we usually have in physical layer security this notion of uniformity of the messages? And it's coming from some information theoretic notions where we have what we call the asymptotic equipartition, which means that after you compress, you have something called the typical set, which is in effect representing the bulk of the probability of your realizations, when your realizations, again, in some asymptotic sense, are large enough. And what it's saying is, items in that typical set are roughly of the same probability. That's what that inequality of the probability, where W here is a word, means. And H is the entropy, again, the Shannon entropy of the words. And it turns out that actually, after compression, you're still not, even though you're in a typical set, you're not uniform, and indeed, the guessing is still asymptotically easier. Okay, it's still asymptotically easier uh, to than guessing than guessing over a truly uniform system. Let me just uh, I'll skip over this. Maybe if people have questions, we can go into it. Because I can see it's already half after, and I think the idea is 45 minutes of presentation, 45 minutes of discussion. So I'm going to skip over some stuff, and I hope will have a very busy discussion. Okay, so remember there were sort of two aspects to physical layer security. One was the uniform messages, and it turns out that unless you're very deliberate about the way in which you're doing the compression, uniform messages, the lambda here is just a difference in expected growth rate of uh, uh, of guessing. Basically, what happens is, it is exponentially easier to guess the original word. Now, there's a second part to the system's security for physical layer security, which is, this notion of signal to noise ratio. Remember, the idea is that having a higher signal to noise ratio was like having two links, having a lower signal to noise ratio was like having one link. And for this, I'm going to do a small detour, which is on something else that's in my 5G phone, which is error correction coding. Now, we touched on error correction coding briefly when we were talking about McLeod's crypto systems. Let's go to error correction now for what it was actually originally meant to do, which was not crypto, but correcting errors. So there's a host of different error correction systems. Remember, an error correction system is at its base a mapping from k bits to n bits, or from k symbols, same Galois field, to another n symbols with a rate k over n. And the n minus k symbols are sort of sacrificial symbols, redundancy, or I prefer calling it repair, in order to make up for errors. And right now, the existing paradigm is a co-design of codes and decoders. So basically, you have dedicated decoders for certain codes. So Reed-Muller codes, which I mentioned before, RM codes, are dedicated with have majority logic. Bose, Chaudhary, Hockenheim codes, BCH codes would be dedicated by Burley, Ken Massey, same Massey we saw before. CRC aided polar codes would be decoded with CRC aided successive cancellation list decoders. You of course have belief propagation decoders. You have, you know, uh, you have neural nets now for decoding, etc. CRCs, which are cyclic redundancy checks, are generally used only for error detection with a couple of twists and exceptions. And random linear codes, which I mentioned before in the hunk system, have currently no decoder. And this is really the reason why you have standards. And one of the things that we have been working on in the group, together with Ken Duffy from Northeastern University, is something we call GRANT, Guessing Random Additive Noise Decoding. Ken, my collaborator, is Irish, so if any of you have spent more than 1 minute in Ireland, you have heard him say that something's grand, everything's grand. So it's a bit of a play on that sort of national overuse of the word. And so rather than having different chips, different chips for different codes, where you can see there on the right is actually our first grand chip, which was presented at ESS-CIRC in 2021. We actually have a second chip, which was presented at ISSCC this year. This was work, the chip design was work not only with Ken, but also with Rabia Zazicigil at Boston University and her fantastic circuits group. Okay, what does GRANT do? At a high level, what GRANT does is, instead of trying to look at why the output, remember this is the same type of notation as we saw before, where Eve was observing a Y. So in In communications and information theory, Y is usually the observation, X is the input, and then N is the noise. So we have this X, which is to the NR. So what does that mean? So if I have an input which was a mapping of k bits onto n bits, I still only had 2 to the k possibilities. So 2 to the nr, where r is k over n. So n times r is k. And the noise, by the same equipartition property that I told you before, that people usually use in order to consider information theoretically the output of compression, or a certain type of compression, information theoretic, typical set compression, it will have roughly, will have most of its probability into the NH, where H is the entropy of the noise possibilities. Now, typical noise on something like a phone or so on would be basically, say, a bit flip probability of around 10 to the minus 3, 10 to the minus 4. Very often when you look at chip, you would measure even a 10 to the minus 5 as being fairly typical. So you're looking at something which, by very simple sort of Taylor series expansion, the H is roughly of the order of the probability of the bit flip. So you have a bit flip of 10 to the minus 3. If n is around, say, a few hundred, like it would be, or even 1,000 or so, like it'd be in a typical code, you're really seeing that, your number of high likelihood, most of your probability for your noise is in a very, very small set. And so we make use of that by decoding, by having a codebook membership test. So rather than having a really sort of fancy codebook construction, we're really just using the codebook as a hash. That's just something where you can check with high probability that you're in the codebook. And Y here is the output. So what do? We guess the noise effect, say a bit flip or whatever the noise effect may be. We invert the effect of the noise. So that's what that minus with a circle is. It's the inversion of the plus. In binary, of course, the inversion of plus is plus. We check whether after inverting the effect of the noise, you have an element of the codebook. Again, that's how we use the codebook as a hash check. And if it is in the codebook, that is actually the most likely transmission, as long as we have been guessing the effect of the noise from most likely to least likely. And the perfect ordering is not very concerning there, because there's a lot of robustness, there's a lot of give, a sparsity in the code, and the number of code books. Okay. But this is a universal decoder. It doesn't matter what the code is, because remember, we're just using the code as a hash. So, right off the bat, by the way, it means that I can do some interesting things. I can take something like AES, which is normally used for encryption, but needs a little bit of padding. And of course, the reason you have to put some padding is to avoid a plain text attack. We can use the padding actually as our n minus k, our redundancy, because actually all the redundancy is remember, it's just a hash. It's just a hash to go from k to n. It's a little bit of a funny hash, right? I mean, typically, when we teach hashing, say if we teach, sometimes I teach our sophomore junior level core algorithms class, you think of hashing as sort of um, hashing to a smaller set. Here you're sort of hashing to a larger set, but that's basically what you're doing. You're going from k bits to n bits, where n is larger than k. It turns out actually that using AES, when you use self-detection, I'm not going to go into what self-detection is. If you're a comms person, you know what it is. If you're not a comms person, all that matters is that it sort of takes it a little bit more into account, not just the plus one minus, it's not just whether you had an error or not, but you have some likelihood of errors. So we have a way of doing self-detection. Actually, our second chip that I mentioned, which appeared in ISSEC this year, does self-detection. But what's funny here is that CA Polo codes, which, as I mentioned before, in the 5G standard, CRCs, which, as I mentioned before, now pretty much only ever used for a detection of errors, not correction. Random linear codes, which, as I mentioned up until now, had no decoder, but actually we knew from information theory should be optimum, and AES are all pretty much the same. So you can see here soft detection with the dashed lines, hard detection. There's barely any difference, particularly when you go to soft detection. So the great news is that we might be able to use crypto itself as an error correction. And of course, now we're relying on whatever the security of crypto is. Um, So that's really fantastic. But let's go back to this noise model, generally ID. If you look at this ID noise model, it's really not a good model of what's happening physically. It's really something where we have created artificially through interleaving uh, a synthetic channel that looks like it has ID, sort of uniformly distributed noise. And the reason for doing that is that traditional decoders, not Grant, are actually based on an ID model and do much worse if you don't have an ID model. So, just to give you some idea here, with Grant, because you can take into account, and again, the sort of correlation that we saw with the naked eye, that that correlation can be represented, say, with the Markov model. That correlation will actually help in guessing the noise. Whether it was traditional decoders, here we can see Berlekamp Massey decoder. If you don't interleave, you're to the right, you do worse. So this is a traditional I should have gone over that here too. This is a traditional figure of merit for communications. Along the CISA, you have what's called EB over N0. EB is energy per bit over N0. N0 is power spectral density of the noise, assuming a Gaussian noise, Gaussian white noise. EB takes into account two factors, if you will, the raw energy of the transmission of the noise. So just like the joules that are transmitted, how loudly you transmit, how high your signal to noise ratio is, and of course it is a signal to noise ratio. But it's also an adjusted signal to noise ratio, because remember that we have this n minus k redundancy. So those n minus k bits also cost you energy. So this takes into account also the energy cost of the redundancy of the n minus k. And it's in dB, so 10 log 10 is what dB are. So 3 dB is a factor of 2, 10 dB is a factor of 10. And along the ordinate, you see the bit error rate, also in logarithmic scale. And generally, we want to be, say, at 10 to the minus 4 or so. So what you can see here is the sort of prototypical systems. And so what you see here is that you have an equivalence of a power factor of 4 when you take into account the fact that the noise is actually not ID. And of course, that's something that Eve is likely to do. Now, I'm basically at quarter of. I'm just going to tell you very briefly. There's some really interesting things to using the kind of post-quantum secure systems, coding systems that I mentioned before. When you look particularly at high frequencies, when you look at different lobes as setting up these different paths that we saw, with minimal computational overhead. And in this case, actually, what we're able to do is use what we saw before as being the physical layer security, where we had no extra crypto, if you will, where we're only using the coding among the different messages. We're able to do that, where basically only Bob sees all of the channels, all of the different lobes at all of the different frequencies, and Eve only ever sees a subset of those lobes. So this is really making use of the physical characteristics. This is work with my postdoc Chia, and also the groups at Rice of Edward Knightley, and at Brown of Dan Mittelman, and also Rafael de Oliveira and Alejandro Cohen, whom I mentioned before. So there's some, without going too much into the exact physics underlying this, what happens again at these, when you go the high frequencies, so hundreds of gigahertz with this lots and lots of free bandwidth, is that you get some very pronounced minima that provide you what we call these blind regions, where blind regions doesn't mean that Eve doesn't see everything. It just means that she doesn't see anything. It means that she doesn't see everything. And only Bob sees everything, and so we can use those sorts of secrecy systems we saw before. It also means that you need to use certain types of antennas, but we are currently, this just appeared um, in the Journal for Special Areas in Signal Processing, and we're doing more experimental work in this area. So with that, I'm not going to go over any of the more machine learning aspects. I talked with I spoke before this with Mark Oliver. I know that you have already been having multiple speakers who are more on the AI ML side. So I'm just going to stop here and look forward to the conversation.
Okay, perfect. So Muriel, this was a great presentation. Thank you so much. If you managed to do, you could go to the tool where you see the images. Then you also see that Alex joins. Also welcome to Alex. I briefly show you. Hello. So you're here also for the questions. So let me just hide the slides for a second. Perfect. Okay. So yeah, wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it because you managed to have a lot of details, a lot of deep diving stuff, and at the same time keeping the big picture. And for the questions, I would like to start with a little bit more general question, and then we would deep dive into the topic, and then at the end, I think it could also be very interesting to talk a bit about more general aspects again. So yeah, so the first question, which I found in the chat, which is very interesting, is so you're doing research that requires a lot of competencies, and if I'm now a student who's just starting his bachelor's or his master's, and I have to select which topics do I want to focus on. So if I want to do research in your area, which would be the competencies where you would say, okay, young folks, this is where you should focus on, and then you will be able to go into the direction I was going.
That's a really good question. I think that definitely taking some probability, I would say, really helps, because it's a combination of, I would say, probabilistic and algebraic thought. Which is, and so, definitely, if you take a course in probability, maybe a course in, whatever your finite algebra course is, a little goes a long way. Just taking a couple courses like that will set you up. And so if you also have an engineering background and you have a little bit more of a, again, it doesn't need to be a very deep mathematical background to become dangerous, then I think you're going to be in really, really good shape. It's good to be a little bit differentiated from your peers, and I think that definitely a bit of probability and a bit of finite fields would be sufficient. Sometimes even if you just take, let's say, a pretty good algorithms class, you'll see some of that finite field background in sufficient detail to do interesting work.
Okay, very good. Very interesting. And so now if I have these backgrounds and I want to go into wireless security, so what could be good starting points? Do I read your papers? Do you have some recommendations for specific textbooks? Can you share a little bit something in that direction?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So one of the things about wireless security is that a lot of it is very meshed in with basically wireless communications, right? And that's a whole big topic unto itself. And it's an arduous topic, not necessarily because conceptually it's arduous. It's just there's a lot of different versions. It's a very active, commercially driven topic, and therefore you have all kinds of different protocols, different modes of transmission, different modulations, et cetera, et cetera. And you don't want to have to spend 10 years learning about all of those. So definitely maybe taking a comms class, but not getting maybe too caught up in the details. I'm going to do a plug. Um, we have a book coming out with Ken Duffy, whom I mentioned, along with my postdoc Vipindev Sudavan, and also Morten Peterson, who's the CTO of Steinwolf that you mentioned. It's called Network Coding for Engineers, and it's actually trying to fill in that gap, which I think the question came about, which is, I'm an engineer, and this sounds interesting, but I really didn't want to have an extra degree in math. Uh, how much do I need to actually do something? So it's very much network coding for engineers. We actually have Python scripts so that you can, you learn just the math you need with exercises, and lots of Python code, so that it's made real, it's made concrete, and it's immediately usable. So that will come out on IEEE Press this coming year. So just shameless plug, but I agree there's a bit of a hole right now. You have sort of very specialist text, or text for people who are really learning information theory as a topic that they wish to delve into very deeply, or you have text for engineers, and the two are not very connected. So I agree that there is a gap right now. Working on it.
Okay, cool. And very good, because I think this is exactly what is needed, that experts like you help a little bit bridging this gap, as you said, between the super technical and not focused on the aspect things and the others, because in the end time is limited, and we have to somehow also be efficient in getting into a field, especially if it's a field where you have a lot of knowledge that you have to absorb. Okay, cool. Now let's go a little bit into the technical questions. So there again, I will start a little bit broader. So you were talking about wireless, and you talked a bit about it, but I want to deepen this aspect a little bit more. And this is the aspect of the medium. So when we talk about wireless today, we typically talk about radio. So radio in the sense of like 5G or Wi-Fi. In the early days of wireless, we had optical communications, and maybe there will be even other communications. So can you say something about the evolution of this field and the impact to your work of the medium that we are using? I will unmute you. Give me a second.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's been a trend towards going towards higher frequencies, higher carrier frequencies, in great part because there's a lot of available spectrum around those higher frequencies. So 5G is the first generation where you have what people call millimeter wave, which is not quite millimeter wave. It's really, around 28 gigahertz or so larger than millimeter wave, but of that order. Lots and lots of spectrum available there, but a lot of other issues, in particular because of the size of the wavelength, obstacles, even very fleeting obstacles, can be extremely disruptive. On the other hand, now it's also something where, for instance, the type of antenna you use starts to become very important. Different antennas are going to have different patterns of radiation, and that's, for instance, what we use in some of the topics that I talked at the very end. So as we go to these higher frequencies, it's sort of like, Maxwell's revenge. You actually do start to have to think a little bit more, in some cases a lot more, about how energy is radiated. Um, and on the electronic side, some of the things that are happening are actually related to the type of electronics that, I've also worked quite a bit in optical, that we're used to seeing more on the optical side. Um, so definitely the medium, as the question brings up, starts to become more important. That was one of the reasons, in some cases, also to try to have an abstraction with these different channels, which is robust. Because, if you start doing something where you go, okay, I can do this if I have one Wi-Fi link, one 5G link at 3 gigahertz, and another 5G link at 28 gigahertz. But wait, if I replace my 28 gigahertz 5G link with, some other link, then, I mean, the combinatorics become unmanageable, right? You have an exponential explosion. It doesn't work. So the idea also would be to sort of be aware of those differences, but try to have an abstraction which allows you to then work over those differences, without having to start from scratch every time.
Cool. When we talk about these physical aspects, I find it very interesting what you just said, because when I look at my computer, for instance, I typically have a wired connection mixed with a Wi-Fi connection. I might even have a 5G connection at the same time. So that means we are now really in the situation that we use different communication links with different characteristics, and they are somehow aggregated to the better or to the worse. I know that this was not the focus of your talk, but maybe can you say something to what impact this has at securing the channels, at using cryptography? Is that I would imagine that the approach today is you do just encryption per channel, which might be not too efficient. So did you look a little bit into that direction? Can you say something into that direction? I also think about beamforming, for instance, so using physical properties of the communication channel in order to increase the security, or the SNR, as you were saying it.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So I don't know if you can see my slides or not, but so in slide 14, it's very much exactly what you just mentioned, Mark Oliver. So it's this notion, and let me see, I'm just going to try to maybe zoom in a little bit, because again, the slideshow doesn't quite work for whatever reason. But this is actually using those multiple paths and actually coding across the several paths. And you really need coding in order to manage multipaths. So right now, when you're connecting with your computer, as you said, you have to pick one of those channels to transmit, right? There are a few systems, for instance, that are being considered, say, an IETF with multipath. But what they do is they do generally repetition. They call it striping, which sounds fancy, but it's really just repetition. Now, the problem is the following. Like, suppose I have two links, say my 5G link and my Wi-Fi link. Typically now I just use one or the other, and I may try to switch to whichever is better, right? Often you have to do this manually. If your system's a little bit better, it does it automatically. But that's not as good as getting the sum of the two. right? So suppose I have now my Wi-Fi and my 5G, and I say, okay, I want to use them both. And if you split your traffic, say you put your odd packets on the Wi-Fi, your even packets on the 5G, you would get twice the speed. Except now, say your Wi-Fi goes down, so packet 1 goes on your Wi-Fi, packet 2 goes on your 5G, packet 3 gets lost on your Wi-Fi. Now packet 4 comes in on the 5G, but the packets have to be delivered in order. So basically, it's like you only got 2 packets, and packets 4, 6, 8, and so on keep coming in on your 5G, but that's of no use. So now what happened is you didn't get the best of the two, you didn't get the sum of the two, you actually got the worst of the two, right? If you do it that way. So what people have said is, okay, I'm going to send the traffic on both paths, but now you have all packets on one path, all packets on the other path. But now what happens is you're wasting a lot of your bandwidth, right? Because you send packet 1 on both of them, so the receiver got 2 copies of packet 1. Well, what it was, 1 copy was enough. But now also packet 2 might get lost on both, and that's no good, right? Because 2 copies of packet 1 don't make up for having no copies of packet 2. So now when you code, what you do is you're sending equations, and every equation is useful. So now you're sending equations on both of them, and if an equation gets lost on one side or both sides, the other equations make up for it. So as long as you create your equations in sort of a sliding window way, in a sensible way, you're now able to make the 2 links look like a single link, and in a way where the losses of one link or the other link or both links don't hurt the overall performance. Yes, the throughput gets reduced by those losses, but it's not catastrophic. You keep going with the traffic. And what we were able to show is that you could do that while encoding on only one of those paths, while still having by encrypting on one of those paths. So encoding across both paths and encrypting only one path, and still get almost the entire gain of the throughput and the delay gain that you get by coding. So it was some work that we showed at Milcom, and that's that slide that I had there. So it's very much along the lines of, sorry, it's a maybe overly detailed answer to your question, but it's exactly what you can do. Basically, you can still do this encryption over only one path while getting the benefit of the coding.
Very, very good, and very, very, very nice answer. So while you were talking about this multi-path routing of packets as we have it in the internet today, another question comes to my mind, which is again a little bit philosophical, but I'm sure you have a point to it, which is security is often put on top of existing communication protocols, which leads to overhead, obviously. And so are we in a good situation, or if you could make a wish of making it doesn't have to be a clean slate, but introducing another modifications in existing protocol suites that would be immediately implemented, which is of course not realistic, but what would be your propositions in order to increase the security and in order to make it also more efficient, because you were talking a lot about efficiency and energy, which is also important for sustainability. So can you share some thoughts in that direction?
Yes, absolutely. So I think particularly in wireless, right, because it's the topic of our discussion today. I touched briefly on standardization when I talked about, error correction coding, why there's standards and so on. Why there's lots and lots of different error correction coding and decoding techniques. Excuse me, but because of standards, because the current approach has been to have a dedicated piece of silicon for a particular decoder matched a particular code, they had to be standard because you couldn't have too many different possibilities. So, like I said, in particular, you have LDPCs, low density parity check codes, which come from the 60s. I mean, they were my academic advisors, Bob Gallagher's PhD thesis. Okay, so they're often called modern codes, but it's a bit of a misnomer. And you have CRC-aided Polo codes, which are modification on Polo codes. Polo codes were invented at the end of the 2000s by also another student of Bob Gallagher, Erdal Arakan. So you're talking about a really very small set of a very limited use of the really rich possibilities out there. And if you remember the slide I showed you where pretty much all codes did the same, it's not because some codes are better than others, right? It's if you use grand, which is an optimal decoder, then you could use any code you want. In particular, you could even use AES directly if you wanted to. I'm not saying you should, but maybe in some systems it's a possibility. Maybe you don't want to have your crypto and your encoder or whatever it may be, right? The fact is that constraints never help in optimization. And the constraints right now are there because the way the standards are built are very monolithic. So a lot of my effort over the last few years, and I am involved in ADIS. So ADIS is the North American 3GPP representative. Many of the people who are listening today may be aware of the European one, EDIS. And so there's a next generation effort. I'm very involved in this. I'm on the research council for it, etc. A lot of what I've been trying to advocate for is a more API oriented approach to wireless systems. That's to say that instead of saying you will use LDPCs with blah, 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 to say, here's your general encoding unit. You put in K bits, outcome N bits, right? And you need to have some header to indicate what the kind of code is. And then you have a general decoding unit. I, of course, think you should use grand. It's optimum. It's, energy is, we broke the energy, but we broke the energy picojoules per bit record by about a factor of 14, right? But you could use something else. You could use a legacy, suboptimal decoder. That's what you have doing. But then you should just have a general decoding unit and go on with it. And I think that from a security perspective, just a robustness security, now this opens so many different possibilities. Now your encoder could, for instance, have crypto in it or be a crypto unit, right? Now you could, and now you could have a system that, I've talked about paths that were physical paths, but you can, of course, create virtual paths, right? And you can code across those paths. So having units which take that into account. Right now, there's, how do you even set up, for instance, multiple paths at the physical layer, right? And code across them. We don't have the APIs for that. So I'm really, really pushing for the APIization of wireless systems. I think that it's just a question of intellectual hygiene. You're seeing some of this now with Open RAN, and of course that's doing, but a lot of Windows, but Open RAN is still somewhat at higher layers. I think there's there's been a mindset that that's not doable as you go down in the layers. I don't think that's true. Intellectually, there's no reason why not. If the right abstractions are put in, and I think that's something that particular computer scientists are very good at, is figuring out those abstractions in a way which is robust, internally consistent, and has real longevity, right? I mean, yes, every so often you need to revisit your abstractions, but I think that having that approach will be extremely valuable for security. I would even argue that until we really go with that approach, our security efforts are going to be very limited, very ad hoc, one-off, and not have the power of an abstraction.
Very, very good. And I'm totally with you regarding the open standards and so on, because it seems like counterintuitive, especially for industry people. But I'm also convinced that it's what should be pushed. You talked a bit about this interplay between algorithms, so software and hardware. And I just throw you three directions, and then you can think about how you react to them. So the first one is post quantum security, which might require also changing some hardware, and this could be an opportunity to do something in case it makes sense to implement things in hardware. The second thing is energy. We were talking about already, like sustainability. So it might be more sustainable to have optimized chips for certain functionality. And the third one is going rather in towards attacks, which is side channels. So which role do side channel attacks play in your work when you design such security mechanisms?
Thank you. Okay, that's a lot of questions. Let me definitely take them one at a time. Let me go into the aspects of algorithms, right? Um, so I think that to me, even when I write some things like with my group, we write decoders and so on. We use standard algorithmic notation, right? We'll have the algorithm in pseudocode, the way that you would have in a computer science um, paper. As a matter of fact, I would say probably most of my teaching right now is actually on the computer science side, um, even though I'm very much an electrical engineer. So I think that's bringing the two together, and I think it goes both ways. I think that for us as electrical engineers to really have, as I said, that sort of more general abstraction of the, that sort of, I'm going to go back to intellectual hygiene, right? Of an algorithmic thought of not just doing derivations and analysis, but then actually seeing how things work. That's very important. But I think it goes the other way too. I think that for computer scientists, taking a little bit more physics, frankly, and this goes back to the first question that that one of the students asked. Have some idea of really how do waves move. Again, Maxwell's revenge, and it doesn't mean that you're going to become an electromagnetics jock, but feeling comfortable with it. One of the problems that happens is, and I think that's a little bit the success. And again, sometimes I co-teach a machine learning class too, so I love it. But sometimes it allows us to get away with a lot. It gives us a lot, but it allows us to get away with a lot. So having maybe a priori physical models more in mind is very useful. The second question that you asked about, which is the specialization, that actually again goes back to the API. Because what the API allows is for a lot more innovation in dedicated chips. It's not that the chips are not dedicated and optimized, it's just that they can be optimized in much more interesting ways because they have a standard input output. Right. So now you can say, wow, I'm going to do a complete, rather than having circuits people all do things for, say, CA polar codes because they're in the standards. Now they can do specialized chips for all kinds of different things because you have an API. So to me, the API is not anathema to more specialized systems. It's actually a requisite to make those specialized systems usable, because otherwise all you're doing is, and when I mean all, I don't mean that it's easy. It's just, it just means that the remit is limited. All you're doing is you're kind of improving in a very, very, drilling down very, very deep in a very, very small field because you have been constrained, artificially constrained. So it's very much, I think, in line to have better hardware, and that actually gets to sustainability. I mean, if you look right now at the physical layer, a lot of the issues around sustainability are just, we are very, very wasteful right now. We're wasting a huge amount of our bandwidth. I mean, I talked when I was going on Grand, and I said, you have to do the NR code words, and you have to do the NH noise sequences roughly, right? So capacity is basically 1 minus h. So you basically need to leave some room for the noise, so that even if I were to compress the noise, which is the best case possible, or the noise was like super polite and just placed itself at the end of the code word, I would still need to leave room for it. That's the best I can do. And turns out you can get arbitrarily close to that. So I mentioned that right now in systems, that noise is about, corresponds to a bit flip of about 10 to minus 3, which means that capacity is like 0.999. You look at the code, the LDPCs that are being used, they're usually being used around rates of, say, 2/3, which means that a third of my bandwidth is already being, and bandwidth means everything, bandwidth, energy, number of base stations being placed, because a lot of the deployment of infrastructure right now is not just for reach, it's more for density, more for increasing access, so that you have fewer users per hertz, if you will. So we're wasting that literally because of bad decoding. Right. In the standards. You then look at other aspects like the ARQ, particularly in the medium access control. We've done experiments, we've gone to base stations, turned off the hybrid ARQ and the ARQ, replaced it with network coding. We got about a 6-fold increase in throughput. Okay. 6-fold. Again, that's energy that's, that's being literally wasted. So I think that actually those go together. So specialization and the APIization go together. And then the what was the last question you asked? Was about.
So the last one was about the attackers, about side channels, how side channels play a role.
Yeah. So the side channels. Yeah. So this is really interesting. So definitely, in the wireless domain, the aspect of side channels and energy that can be captured by an attacker is extremely interesting, right? One of the things I didn't really one of the things I didn't really go into is the fact that we have that some of the side channel attacks that people thought were not very doable are much more doable with Grant. So there are schemes, for instance, to use, I mentioned that physical layer security, I didn't go much into it, that, if you use, the assumptions there was that the Eve was using a traditional decoder. And with a traditional decoder, She wouldn't be able to decode certain codes because of complexity, et cetera, sort of traditional cryptographic style arguments. But if she uses GRAND, she's actually able to, not always, but she's able to decode because of the statistical aspect. Sometimes she gets lucky. She gets lucky often enough, even though her signal to noise ratio is low. And when she does, she also has the good enough certainty or confidence in what she decoded that it is a very effective attack. So there's definitely new attack schemes in there that that didn't go much into.
Mm-hmm. Very, very good. Thanks again. So, as last technical aspect before we open up a bit, because we only have 9 minutes left. So you also said that your the coding is you're using the spectrum very efficiently, and so the importance of error correcting codes might increase if you use the spectrum such efficiently, because any physical problems might end up in some bit flips and so on, as you said. So could you give some more details about this connection between the cryptography and the error correcting codes? Because I think this is very exciting, because it's spanning into so many dimensions again, including sustainability.
Yeah, so it's interesting because, to some extent, our results show that error correcting code doesn't matter so much as error correction, right? As I showed you, they all pretty much do the same. But I think they do matter a lot for security. So let's go back to this post-quantum aspect. What do we call it post-quantum? So I mentioned public key crypto systems like McLeese. So our workhorse of public key crypto system right now is uh, RSA, right? And one of the things that made that had a big splash was, so RSA was co-developed by Ron Rivest, who's one of my colleagues in my department, and another colleague at MIT, Peter Shore, a few years ago showed how you could program a quantum computer to, and again, with quantum computing, everything is probabilistic, right? With high probability, be able to, let's say, break. I hate the word break, right? But let's use break, but with with a lot of caveats around it. RSA, right? So that had a huge splash, because then people said, okay, RSA is not post quantum secure. Okay. So I mentioned McLeese is one of the schemes that's been looked at right now by NIST. There are others. Some of them use, uh, you know, other coding schemes in effect. Kyber and others. Now, the problem is that these are still being generally used with a public key system to exchange a key, and then you use a symmetric key system like AES. Okay. And the reason is because, okay, so why is McLeese considered to be post-quantum secure? Well, because it hasn't been broken, right? And there is no known algorithm that would break it. And it relies on what I mentioned in my talk, that Z noise, right? That there's no efficient way to sort of get around that Z noise, in combination with the GOPA error correcting code that underpins McLeese. So you need two things. You need a very cleverly constructed code, and you need that Z noise. The problem is that it's really, really expensive. Remember, there was the overhead, and Hunk got around the overhead of the bits that are being added in there for the post-quantum scheme. But also, actually, the way McLeese works is that it kills Eve by almost killing Bob. So the encryption overhead is massive, absolutely massive, which is why you can do it right now kind of one time just to exchange a key, and then you go with symmetric key like AES that I mentioned. But people are not and looking at doing that long term. Now you get down to, all right, now the only thing that you have left is AES, right? With your little S boxes. um People say trying to move from 128 to 256, again because of the concern around quantum computing attacks. Is that enough? Who knows, is the bottom line. I think that one of the things that we're really trying to push is to say, well, look, if you used coding not just inside the crypto system, like McLeese does, but also outside with network coding, like we showed with our hybrid scheme, now you might be able to actually use something post-quantum. So the proof that we have is that the security of the system is as good as the security of the underlying crypto. So if you have a post-quantum secure system, say like McLeese, then the entire system is also post-quantum secure with this outside coding. So now you might be able to use it all the time. You might be able to be secure all the time at a post-quantum level. Whereas what we're talking about post-quantum security right now really isn't. It's even just in the exchange for the symmetric key. And then your symmetric key crypto is actually doing the bulk of the security, right? It's just for the key exchange. So I don't know, it's a bit of a long-winded answer to your question, but so look at coding not just inside, but outside.
Yeah, very good. I love the answer. So we only have 3-4 minutes left. Let's totally jump out of the topic and go to something that I also always consider important, which is cybersecurity education, sensibilizing people for cybersecurity. With you, I have the big chance having someone who knows very different cultural systems. So you know the French system, you know the American system, you might know even other systems. So from that, you probably also observed a bit how aware are people of cybersecurity needs, how aware are they of my work in the sense that it's needed, which might be a little bit specific question, but you will probably understand what I mean. Because in France, for instance, especially in Britain, you have the impression people are okay concerned with cybersecurity, which is good. When I still was in Germany, I mean, this was some time ago, but there I had the impression people were not so much aware. And I'm always, especially with this series, trying to push people to have more understanding. Do you have some secrets, some cultural differences to share, how we make people aware, and what are the different perceptions in the different countries?
Good question. I certainly don't have a secret. I may have some general remarks, which are just personal, and as my husband says, the plural of anecdotes is not data, but it's something, right? Um, I think. I think in Europe in general, certainly people are keenly aware of privacy. I think I credit GDPR very much for that. Privacy is not exactly security, but it's very, it's a very close cousin, right? So I think once you're aware of privacy, then you're naturally sort of sensitized to issues of security. Uh, so I think that having that sort of, let's say, ambient uh, legal, fairly well understood, societally, integrated um, framework helps a bit in thinking about security. I think in the U.S., maybe people are a little less secure, a little less privacy oriented, but maybe a little bit more security aware. In the sense that certainly, certain breaches, and I think the certainly my view is that there's more more vehicles for collaboration between military systems and academia in the US over Europe. I mean, not that they don't exist in Europe, and not that, of course, there's not a lot of collaboration with civilian and commercial systems in the US. But so I think that maybe some of the aspects more around, more classical cybersecurity are a little bit more integrated. That's my view. So very high level. Yeah.
And that's quite interesting, because I already have this impression coming from Germany to France, because in Germany, the military is traditionally, after the Second World War, quite separately perceived from the society, and therefore in France I already have the impression that when it comes to cybersecurity, it's necessary to centrally enforce policies and so on. That this is already working much better here, and it's quite interesting that you say in the US you have the impression that it's even stronger. So yeah, very, very, very good point. Okay, cool. So unluckily, time is already up. We did not cover even all of the questions, but I think we did a very good spectrum. And as typically, I also especially love the discussion, because in the discussion, you can always deepen a little bit, and it's interactive and so on. So really big thank you, Muriel, for this edition. And yeah, and thanks that we also worked with my tool, because it was in the end working quite okay.
It did. I had my doubts. You managed to pull it off. Okay.
Okay, good. So yeah, so thanks a lot for joining. Thanks a lot for the questions today. So for the next edition, it will be obviously in the next year. So the next things coming up are end of the year festivities, if you are celebrating Xmas, for instance, or other things at the end of the year. So all the best for the next year. I hope you enjoyed a lot this year's edition. I hope you enjoyed a lot all the many different aspects. Yeah, very nice. All the many different aspects that we covered in this year, and I'm very happy that we ended the year with such a highlight. You will have the end trailer as usual, and there are also the dates. So the next edition is planned for end of January. Recommend the series to your friends, especially share also today's edition, because it was great. I mean, you participated, and people can still watch it. It's online from now on. And yeah, looking forward to see you in the next year. Enjoy and stay safe. Goodbye.
Cher cybercéanie, pôle d'excellence région Bretagne. Au revoir et à la prochaine.